Every dawn he woke up praying in a language he never learned. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night, mumbling words you've never heard before. It's not Portuguese, it's not English, it's something old, something strange, something that doesn't seem to come from you. Mateus was an atheist. He never believed in spirituality, past lives, or anything that wasn't rational. But in the last few weeks, he started waking up every morning at 3:17 a.m., praying. At first, he thought it was just stress or insomnia, until his girlfriend recorded what he was saying, and when I showed it to an expert, the response was as unbelievable as it was frightening. He was reciting sacred prayers from an extinct civilization in a language that disappeared centuries ago. But why him? Why now? And what did your spirit still need to purify? If that already gave you goosebumps, imagine what comes next. So leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and get ready to dive into a story that neither science nor reason can explain. Mateus never believed in anything that couldn't be measured, tested, or proven. For him, the spiritual world was a comforting invention for fragile minds, an invisible crutch for those fearful of the end. A staunch atheist, his beliefs were grounded in logic, science, and reason. And to a certain point in his life, that was enough. He slept soundly, worked hard, and didn't allow himself to be distracted by the inexplicable. But everything began to change. Silently, almost imperceptibly, the first few nights were strange, but not enough to alarm him. He would wake around 3 in the morning, sweaty and heart racing, a tightness in his chest as if he were being watched, and a vague feeling that he had returned from somewhere. He always fell back asleep within a few minutes, attributing the episode to stress or food, nothing a strong coffee couldn't cure. But the awakenings began to repeat themselves, always at the same time, always with the same pressure in my lungs. Only now something else was happening. Mateus would wake up murmuring words, whole sentences in a calm but firm tone, as if you were praying. The detail? He hadn't prayed since he was a child, and now at 34, I would wake up chanting something that made no sense, not in Portuguese nor in any language I knew. His girlfriend Camilla was the first to notice. One of those early mornings, she woke up to find him sitting on the bed, eyes closed, whispering. His tone was solemn, the words repeated like a litany. When she touched him, he simply lay down and went back to sleep, remembering nothing the next morning. In the days that followed, Mateus began to notice a pattern. Whenever he woke up this way, his body felt exhausted, as if he had participated in something intense, ceremonial. The sensation wasn't a nightmare, it was ritual, as if his soul had returned from some kind of ceremony his mind couldn't quite grasp. But his body remembered, curious, and a little scared. He asked Camilla to record one of those nights. She resisted at first, thinking it was an exaggeration, but she relented, and in the first recording, they both fell into absolute silence as they listened to the audio. It wasn't babbling. It wasn't delirium. It was a sequence of phrases, rhythmic, paused, spoken with impressive clarity, prayerful phrases. But in what language? Mateus heard it dozens of times. He tried to identify some Latin root, without success. He searched machine, translations, nothing. It was as if he were channeling something from another time, another place, another someone. The following days were a whirlwind of doubts. His skepticism tried to scream, searching for neurological explanations, sleep disorders, even cognitive dissonance. But nothing explained how, suddenly, someone with no spiritual background, no faith even in faith, began to chant prayers that seemed too ancient to have been invented by chance. With each dawn, the feeling intensified, and with it, a growing anguish, not of fear but of urgency, as if something were trying to emerge, as if those words had a purpose, something that needed to be said, something that needed to be concluded. On the last night of that initial cycle, he woke early, 3:17 a.m., with wet eyes and his throat still hot from the words he'd just spoken. Camilla, already with tears in her eyes, said, "You ended with a sentence I understood." Matthew looked at her in silence. "You said, 'Let what was interrupted be completed.'" The audio recorded that morning became a turning point. Mateus, who had always mocked those who believed in invisible forces, now found himself confronted with something he couldn't quite place. He heard himself chanting a complete prayer with cadence, pauses, and almost ritualistic intonation in a language he didn't recognize, and it disturbed him in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was a deep unease, as if he were treading a path he hadn't chosen, but of which he had long been a part. Camilla, who had previously dismissed the situation as a curious episode of sleep, now showed signs of concern. There was something about that audio that inexplicably moved her. The words sounded ancient, very ancient, as if they carried centuries of history between each syllable. The couple then decided to take the recording to someone who could technically analyze the speech. First, they consulted a friend who was a phonetics professor who confirmed what was already obvious. It wasn't random babbling or glossolalia, the so-called speaking in tongues common in religious rituals. It was an organized linguistic construction, a real language. "But which one?" asked Matthew, his voice tense. "I don't know, and that's the strangest thing." The following days were a parade of emails, audio messages sent to universities, online forums, and contacts in historical linguistics departments. Most of the responses were evasive. "We don't recognize it. It doesn't correspond to any living language. Perhaps a phonetic recreation." Only one professor, a retired linguist from the Institute of Ancient European Languages, responded with something different. He requested a video call. He was visibly shocked. "Mr. Matthew, what I'm about to say may sound strange, but what you're chanting corresponds to fragments of an ancient ritual language used in the Middle East, possibly during the pre-Aramaic period, predating even recorded Hebrew traditions. It's something that appears only in deteriorated manuscripts, with vocabulary restricted to sacred contexts. What strikes me is that you're reciting almost complete excerpts of a purification prayer." Matthew was silent. The linguist continued, "This form of prayer disappeared over 1,000 years ago. It is not spoken, it is not taught. There are no accurate phonetic records of it, only reconstructions, and even those incomplete." Camilla shook Mateus's hand. "How can someone who has never studied this speak like that?" she asked. The teacher shook his head. "I only knew this because I studied fragments for decades, but what you have on the recording seems complete. It's as if he had heard it from inside a temple, from within a rite, not from outside, as a scholar." That phrase echoed for hours in Mateus's mind. From within a rite. How could someone participate in a ritual that had been extinct for millennia? How could they chant prayers that no longer exist? The doubt, once intellectual, began to reach a personal, existential level. If the words were coming from him, then where else would they come from, if not from within? It was that night that fear finally hit. He woke again at 3:17 a.m., but this time his hands were shaking. He was sitting up, and at the end of the prayer, which he didn't remember starting, a sentence came out with sharp clarity, as if speaking in another voice. "May what was interrupted be completed." And with that, the early morning silence seemed denser, as if the world, for a second, had stopped to listen to that sentence being spoken. The phrase wouldn't leave Matthew's mind. "May what was interrupted be completed." He repeated it silently, as if trying to decipher a hidden code. It wasn't just the content of the prayer that disturbed him, but the fact that it seemed incomplete, as if those words were the conclusion of something much greater, a ritual, a purpose, a journey interrupted not in his current life, but in another, one that might not even be his, but that lived within him. Camilla suggested they seek out the linguist again. There were details in those words that perhaps even the professor hadn't noticed. And indeed, when they sent new recorded excerpts, the response came almost immediately, this time accompanied by an unusual request that Mateus appear in person at the Institute. The following week, in a room with walls covered in maps, ancient manuscripts, and reproductions of cuneiform inscriptions, Mateus sat before three professors. The lead linguist, now accompanied by a historian of religion and an anthropologist, explained that they had studied the new recording carefully, and what they discovered was disturbing. "What you are saying in your dream is more than a prayer. It is an invocation," the historian began. "This language belongs to an obscure branch of rituals used by an extinct spiritual order, predating the known biblical records. There is no recorded name for it. The few fragments we have were found in ruins closed to the public, but there is correspondence." Matthew remained silent. "The sequence you repeat corresponds to what we call prayer for the restoration of the cycle. It was used when a sacred ritual was interrupted before its end, which, according to the texts, created a spiritual imbalance that affected the officiant himself." The anthropologist then added, "This ancient order believed that certain ritual errors could mark the soul, and the only way to wash away this stain would be to repeat the ritual, to incarnate again, to go through the same experience until one could complete what was interrupted." Mateus felt a chill run down his back. "Are you suggesting that I've lived this before? We don't claim anything. We just say that what you sing corresponds, with frightening precision, to something that no one alive should be able to reproduce, much less someone with no contact with these texts." The scholars then showed a black and white image, an ancient stone covered in moss and cracks, with symbols carved in a spiral. In the center, the same final phrase from the recordings, loosely translated, "May what was interrupted be completed." This inscription is on the wall of an abandoned temple located in a desert region of Central Asia. It was discovered decades ago, but never made public. The symbols are the same as what you describe. Mateus didn't know what to say. A mixture of dread and fascination consumed him. He felt, in every fiber of his being, that none of this was coincidence. And at the same time, his rational mind screamed, trying to find logical explanations for the inexplicable. But there was something even more disturbing. The historian looked at him seriously and said, "In all the accounts we have of these rituals, there is one constant. Whoever interrupted the ceremony carried the consequences for more than one lifetime. You may be the first documented case of a soul trying to conclude." Mateus left the institute without knowing if it was the same man who had entered. He went to sleep that night with the recording playing on loop on his phone, his eyes open in the darkness, and his heart clenched with a question that would never leave him alone. And if this is all true, what exactly was interrupted? Mateus began to dread bedtime, not because his dreams were nightmares in the traditional sense, but because every time he closed his eyes, he was transported to the same place. And that place didn't feel like a dream. It felt like a memory. It was always the same scene, an ancient temple carved into the rock with wide columns and walls that seemed to exude the scent of time. The torches attached to the walls illuminated spiraling inscriptions with symbols he didn't recognize, but which seemed familiar. It was like walking through a forgotten memory, where each stone told a part of a story his mind refused to recall, but which his body knew by heart. In his early dreams, he simply watched. He was like an invisible spectator walking among hooded shadows, chanting low, gravelly songs in a language he now recognized. It was the same one he spoke in the wee hours of the morning. The chants followed a hypnotic, pulsating rhythm, like the beating of a ritual heart. The sound didn't echo, it filled the space like a sonorous mist, intense, ancient. But after a few days, something changed. Mateus began to dream of himself inside. That temple, no longer an observer. Now, he was part of the ceremony. He was kneeling in the center of the hall, surrounded by hooded figures. Their robes were different. made of a thick fabric with gold embroidery. He couldn't see his own face, but he knew, with the instinctive certainty of someone who recognizes themselves, that it was him, that kneeling presence, repeating phrases while holding a small, inscribed stone. On one of the most intense nights, he saw himself interrupt the ritual. Something was wrong. One of the torches would go out on its own. The chanting would lose its rhythm. One of the hooded men would approach, and he, the old him, would stand up, panicked, trying to repeat the last prayer, but he couldn't. The words would fail. The stone would slip from his hand. A collective murmur would fill the room, and everything would go dark in a red flash. He would wake up sweating, trembling, with the words cut halfway through his throat. Camilla began to notice the change. Mateus was no longer the same. He walked around the house in silence, avoided trivial conversations, and compulsively read books about extinct religions and ritual archaeology. There was something in his eyes, an added presence, as if part of him were living between two times at once. A detail in his dreams began to recur. On the temple walls, there was always a central inscription, circular, spiraling, like a seal. Each night, the inscription seemed clearer, closer, as if he were being led to that image. One night he touched the stone in his dream and felt his skin sting as if burning from within. When he woke, he had a slight redness on the palm of his hand, a faint swirl like a contact mark. It was inevitable. The dreams weren't dreams, they were visits. And the temple, however distant it was geographically, now seemed close, as if it lived within it. More than a vision, it seemed a cold, a real place that needed to be rediscovered so he could finally understand what he had and done, and above all, what he hadn't accomplished. That's when he noticed something even more disturbing. Every night he saw the temple. The last word of the prayer whispered before waking was always the same: return. Mateus's mind had always been strong, rigid, structured, solid as cement. He had built a life based on certainties, and among them, the most impenetrable was, nothing exists beyond what can be seen, touched, or measured. But this concrete was beginning to crack, and the cracks were coming from within. The temple, the prayer, the extinct language, the dreams, the mark on the hand. It was all too much to ignore, but also too much to accept calmly. And it's in this gray area between the deniable and the undeniable that doubt begins to become a poison. Silently, it contaminated every aspect of Mateus's life. First, it drove him away from work. He could no longer concentrate. Then, from friends, commitments, and trivial conversations. Camilla tried to maintain a routine, but it was like living with someone who was in two worlds at once. He spent hours staring into space, as if at any moment something would emerge from his memory. He relived every dream, every intonation, every sensation with obsessive precision. He began to jot down phrases, symbols, images. He filled notebooks with drawings of the temple and its inscriptions, all compulsively, as if racing against an invisible time, as if there were a countdown only he could hear. Camilla insisted he seek medical and psychological help, and he even tried. But how could he explain to a rational therapist that he was waking up every morning speaking a dead language and dreaming of a temple that actually exists, thousands of miles away? How could he report with clinical coldness that there's a mark on his body that appears for no reason in the same place where he touched a stone in a dream? No. Matthew knew it wasn't a hallucination, and the more he tried to deny it, the more the emptiness grew. A dark hole inside his chest that seemed to have only one answer: find out what was interrupted. His home became a laboratory for reincarnation. He read everything he could about regressions, Eastern spirituality, and ancient initiatory orders. Nothing seemed complete. Everything seemed fragmented, as if the truth he sought were scattered like shards of an ancient mirror. And it was then that he began to see faces in his dreams. Quick ones, distorted ones, hooded men. But there was one face that kept coming back, his own, not his current face. It was the same body from his dreams. young with different features, a serene yet heavy gaze, and in the eyes of that other Mateus, there was a silent plea, a look that implored, "Understand me." One night upon waking, he looked in the bathroom mirror and caught a glimpse. For a brief second he didn't see himself. He saw that other, the same one from his dreams, the same gaze, the same silence. The reflection lasted a second, but it was enough to break down what resistance remained. Mateus fell to his knees, crying, not knowing if what he felt was sadness, guilt, or a longing that came from before he was born. The obsession, once painful, now seemed necessary. It was no longer about whether it was true or not. It was about because that chose him, and what exactly was still waiting to be completed. Mateus never imagined himself sitting before a medium. For someone who had always based his life on science and reason, it seemed an absurd contradiction. But at that moment, nothing else made sense, except the pain he felt when he slept, the emptiness growing inside, and the eyes that stared at him in his dreams with a silent plea for redemption. The medium was a gentleman with a slow voice, silver hair, and eyes so calm they seemed to see beyond the present. His name was Augusto. He didn't charge for consultations, didn't advertise, didn't ask for faith. He simply listened. And that's what he did with Mateus. For minutes, Mateus poured out everything. His dreams, his prayers, the ancient language, the mark on his skin, the hooded faces, the temple he'd never visited but knew as if he'd been born there. He spoke until he was breathless. Augusto simply listened, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes closed, as if he heard other voices too, not Mateus's but the ones whispering behind those words. When Matthew finished, the medium remained silent for several seconds. Then he said, "You're not dreaming, you're remembering." Matthew felt a shiver run down his spine. "What do you mean by that?" Augusto opened his eyes, now charged with a different energy. It wasn't judgment, nor compassion. It was something older, almost respectful. The soul, when marked by something unresolved, does not forget. It simply becomes silent. But time does not erase what needs to be completed. What you are experiencing is an echo from another life, a call from your own spiritual consciousness to complete something you left incomplete. But incomplete how? I don't remember. I don't know what I did. The medium leaned forward slightly. You made a mistake within a sacred ritual, a mistake that compromised more than just you. It compromised the harmony of a spiritual circle. That ritual was meant to be a closing ritual, a purification ritual, but it was interrupted. And by being interrupted, it opened something that shouldn't have been opened. Mateus felt his heart race. His hands were sweating. And now, Augusto took a deep breath. Now, your soul tries to repeat the cycle. Dreams are not just memories, they are rehearsals. You are being prepared over and over to complete it. But remembering is not enough. You have to acknowledge it, feel it, and choose to complete it. Complete what? The medium didn't respond with words. He simply pointed to Mateus's chest, where the spiral mark, still subtle, had begun to darken over the past few nights. This will guide you. That same night, Matthew dreamed again, but this time the temple was empty. There were no chants, no hooded people, just him, alone, walking along the stones. In the center, a lit torch. As he approached, he saw a mirror in front of the flame, and within it, the same face from his dreams, younger, lighter, but with eyes heavy with guilt. The reflection spoke, but the mouth didn't move. The voice came from within himself. You stopped, out of fear, but now you have the chance to finish, consciously. When he woke up, Matthew didn't scream. He didn't sweat. He just cried silently, no longer out of confusion, but because deep down I was beginning to understand. He wasn't being punished. He was being asked to make amends. Knowing doesn't mean accepting, and accepting doesn't mean being ready. Mateus, even faced with everything he had experienced, the scars, the dreams, the voices, and the revelations, couldn't completely surrender. It was like standing before an abyss he knew he needed to cross, but whose edges trembled with the wind of doubt. His mind was still the same one that once rejected anything without a logical explanation, and now even plunged into the inexplicable. That part of him resisted. It fought. In the days following his appointment with Augusto, Mateus tried, for the first time, interrupt the cycle. He avoided sleep. He spent entire nights awake, watching random videos, walking around the house like a modern-day ghost, with deep, dark circles and restless eyes. He drank coffee like someone protecting himself with armor. He tried to trick his own body, but his body, and something else inside him, knew the way, knew the time. The first night he slept away from home, he thought that perhaps the change of scenery would break the streak. He rented a hotel room in another neighborhood with the windows locked and the lights on. He took 2 sleeping pills, fell into a deep sleep, and still woke up at 3:17, sitting, eyes closed, whispering. Camilla, who was with him, was no longer crying. She just watched. She understood that he was going through something no one could walk with him. It was a journey for one's soul. Over the next few nights, Mateus tried everything, sleeping at friends' houses, in hotels with blessed energy, in rooms without mirrors, with coarse salt around the bed, even with headphones playing white noise. Nothing worked. The call cut through everything, always at the same time. 3:17. And the final sentence, spoken now with ever-increasing clarity, was always the same. May what was interrupted be completed. But that night something changed. Upon waking, the prayer didn't stop with the final phrase. It continued for a few more words, and between phrases an image came to mind, a dark stone with spiral inscriptions, and for a second, a fragmented memory, he running away, the hymn from the past, interrupting the ritual, dropping the stone, and leaving the temple as if escaping a sentence. Guilt hit me like a sharp blow to the chest, a guilt that wasn't of this life, but it weighed as if it were. When he woke, Matthew didn't say anything. He just sat there staring at the ground. His fear was no longer of the unknown. It was of what he knew he would have to do. There was a part of him that screamed, "Don't go!" But there was another that whispered, in the same voice he heard in his dreams, "You've run away before. You can't run away again." The marks on his chest began to darken. The spiral was now visible even under his clothes, like an ancient scar burning silently. No doctor could explain it, no tests detected any change, but it was there, and it was still pulsing. At 3:17 a.m., Camilla, in a mixture of desperation and acceptance, finally asked, "If there's no way to escape, what are you going to do?" And for the first time, without hesitation, Matthew answered, "I will find that place." And so it was that, overcome by his own soul, he began searching. Maps, images of forgotten temples, spiral inscriptions carved in stone, until one sleepless night he saw a black and white photo in an obscure archaeological article, an inscription, the same symbol, and a name, Takralun, an abandoned temple lost among the stone mountains of Central Asia, closed to the public, forgotten even by most scholars. But Matthew knew he wasn't going for the first time. He was coming back. The image was grainy, aged, and poorly lit, but for Mateus, it was like meeting an old acquaintance. The grey stone in the photo, spiral inscriptions he had drawn, dreamed, and seen on the walls of the dream temple. There was no longer any doubt. The place was real. The name, written in small print in the corner of the article, Takralun, a lost temple in the mountains of Central Asia, closed to the public since the 1980s due to structural instability, or, as archaeological rumors had it, unexplained phenomena that frightened the original excavation team. For anyone else, this information would be the end of the search. But for Mateus, it was the beginning. He sold the car, he quit, he cancelled everything. Camila, between tears and pride, didn't try to stop him. She knew Mateus's body no longer belonged to ordinary life. His gaze was that of someone with a mission, an old agreement to fulfill. She hugged him for the last time at the airport and said with a trembling voice, "Come back, in one piece." The journey was long. 2 layovers, hours of driving in rented jeeps, then on foot, using old printed maps, a compass and a GPS that failed as he approached the region. He was guided more by instinct than coordinates. Each step was like crossing a mist between time and space. At many moments, I didn't know if I was in the present or traversing layers of the past. And then, after days of silent trekking among rocks and dust, there it was, Takralun. The temple appeared partially buried, shrouded in roots that tore at its walls and stones broken by time. Even partially destroyed, it was identical to what he'd seen in his dreams. The wide columns, the dark corridor, the symbols carved with ritualistic precision. But what chilled him most was the sensation. He who knew where each thing was. He knew the way to the main hall, even though he had never been there physically. His feet moved on their own. His eyes sought details that his body's memory already knew. At every step, a déjà vu. At every turn, an emotional memory without an image. As he walked down the aisle to the altar, his heart seemed not just a beat. It seemed Toto remember. In the center of the temple stood the circular stone with the inscriptions, intact, as if time dared not erase it. The same stone from dreams, the same one that slipped from his hands in the memory of a past life. Matthew knelt before her. His eyes were watery, his body was silent, and without thinking, he began to pray. But this time, it wasn't like the early mornings. The prayer came complete. Every word flowed perfectly. The intonation, the gestures, even the breathing. It was as if he was finally living what he had so often dreamed of, but now awake, conscious. The moment he uttered the final sentence, "May what was interrupted be completed," a gentle wind swept through the temple. The extinguished torches reignited on their own, casting dancing shadows across the walls. The air grew lighter. The stone beneath his hand seemed to vibrate as if in gratitude. And then silence. But it was silence, different. Not the heavy silence of past dawns, but a silence of closure, of peace. Matthew burst into tears. But they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of liberation. He felt that for the first time in many lives something had happened, closed, and with that, something new could finally begin. The temple was silent. The stones, cool to the touch, seemed to absorb the moment like ancient witnesses. Matthew remained kneeling before the stone with spiral inscriptions, feeling the vibrations slowly cease. The prayer was over. The cycle, apparently, too. But then, something changed in the air. It wasn't a sound, nor a light. It was a presence, an invisible weight that filled the space like an ancient sigh returning to the body. Mateus felt the hairs on his arms stand on end. The temperature dropped slightly. Time seemed to slow down, and then he saw. In front of you, without warning, was himself, not his reflection nor his dream, but a living image, the him of another era, dressed in the ceremonial robes that appeared in dreams, with long dark hair, his hands scarred by time, and his face younger, but with a gaze that held centuries. There was no astonishment. Neither version of themselves showed fear. It was as if they had been waiting for each other for a long time. Matthew stood up slowly. The other man did too. There were no words, just a look, and in that instant, they recognized each other, not like strangers, but as fragments of the same being. The memory came like a whirlwind, intense flashes of the interrupted. And ceremony, the exact moment he, in his past life, hesitated. The fear, the doubt, the premonition that the ritual would come at a price he wasn't ready to pay. And in fleeing, the cycle was broken. That temple, sealed for centuries, held more than ruins. It held unfulfilled promise. Mateus approached the other and, without knowing why, repeated with a choked voice, "I went back." The other nodded with a small gesture, and for the first time, he smiled. Together, they knelt before the stone. Their hands overlapped. their voices in unison, chanting the prayer once more, but this time perfectly, without flaws, without interruptions, with faith and awareness. Finally, a deep sound echoed through the temple. It wasn't a physical sound. It was something inside him realigning itself. The mark on Matthew's chest began to heat up, but this time it didn't burn. It was like a seal gently closing. The image of the other me began to fade, not painfully but lightly, like dust returning to the wind, like a soul returning to time. And in the last instant before disappearing completely, he whispered, "Now you are whole." Matthew remained kneeling for minutes, silent. The temple seemed brighter, the air lighter. It was as if all the stones breathed a sigh of relief, as if the place itself expressed gratitude for the completion it had waited for ages. As he left the temple, the world felt different, quieter inside. For the first time in a long time, I was in no hurry. He slept under the stars that night, in the middle of the desert, like someone resting after a long walk. And he didn't wake up at 3:17 a.m. Not a voice, not a whisper, not a prayer, just peace. Mateus returned to the country a few days later, silent, light, changed. He hadn't told anyone in detail what happened inside the temple, not even Camilla. Not for fear of appearing crazy, but because he knew, with the conviction that came from his soul, that some experiences cannot be put into words. They are things only the spirit understands, and sometimes silence is the only form of truth. The first few days were spent adapting, relearning how to live in a world that once seemed so solid, but now seemed full of cracks. People continued to rush, complain, buy, lose, love, but Mateus observed it all as if returning from a place no one had ever returned from. He slept deeply, without interruptions, without whispers, without prayer, never woke up at 3:17 again. But the mark remained. The spiral on his chest, which had previously appeared as a faint burn, was now a discreet but permanent scar. Over time, he stopped trying to hide it. It was his personal keepsake, his cosmic tattoo, the seal of a cycle closed. Camilla noticed he was different, calmer, more introspective, more present. The anxiety that had once consumed him now gave way to a more serene look. She didn't ask questions. He didn't lie. He simply said, one Saturday night as they drank coffee on the porch, "I had something old stuck inside me. I needed to go there, to release it." She smiled and held his hand. It was enough. Life went on, but with a different rhythm. Mateus returned to work, but without the same fervor as before. He dedicated himself more to the essentials. He began to write in silence, as if exercising memories with his pen. Notebooks and notebooks filled with fragments of memories, symbols, reflections and prayers that were now part of him, not like a prison, but as part of his spiritual history. One afternoon, passing by a small neighborhood bookstore, he came across an old book with a worn cover, the title, "The Eternal Return of the Soul." As he leafed through it, he found a passage underlined by some old reader, "What the soul does not complete, time returns." Matthew smiled. That was it. Sometimes during his bath he could still feel the scar burning gently, not as pain, but as a reminder, a distant echo. And every time he touched that silent spiral, his mind returned to the image of the temple, the final prayer, and the other him who was now at peace. One Sunday, walking through the city, he stopped in front of an old church. A group was singing a simple but faith-filled song. He stood there, listening. He didn't go in. He didn't pray. But something inside him bowed in silence, because now he knew he didn't need to understand everything with his mind. Some answers only come when you listen with the soul. And in that moment, with the wind touching my face, the world seemed to fall silent for a few seconds, and the silence wasn't the absence of sound, it was presence of mind.